Hey guys, tonight dim the lights a little, maybe lower the volume. Get comfortable. This is one of those stories you do not need to visualize too clearly. Just let it drift by. Tonight we are talking about what life was really like for women sold into medieval harems. Not the fantasy version, not the silk pillows and endless baths version, the slow, quiet, human version. The kind of life that stretches on for decades and mostly involves waiting. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin. When people hear the word harem, their brain tends to sprint off in a very specific direction. Silk curtains, perfume, jealous rivals lounging on cushions, a bored ruler clapping his hands and summoning someone like it is a room service order, which is understandable. Medieval writers loved exaggeration, later European writers loved exaggeration even more, and modern pop culture did not exactly come along to calm things down. But the reality was quieter, slower, and in many ways much more tedious. Most women who entered a medieval harem did not arrive dramatically. There was no grand procession for them, no ominous music, no moment where they knew they were stepping into history. For most of them, it started with movement, being moved from one place to another, sometimes across a city, sometimes across an empire, often with very little explanation. Some were war captives, some were sold by families who needed money or protection, some were tribute, some were taken during raids that barely made it into official records. A lot of them were very young. Early teens were common, preteens were not unheard of. Childhood was a flexible concept back then, and not in a charming way. The journey itself could take weeks or months, by foot, by cart, by boat, by whatever was available. They traveled with guards, traders, or officials who saw them less as people and more as inventory that needed to arrive intact, which sounds grim, but it also meant they were usually fed and protected. This was an investment after all. When they arrived at the palace, or citadel, or fortified residence, they were not immediately placed into luxury. First came sorting, assessment, quiet conversations behind doors, age, appearance, health, language. Could they read? Could they sing? Did they cry too much? Did they look healthy enough to survive palace life? Most were then sent to the inner quarters, the women's quarters. The harem was not one room, it was an entire enclosed world. Apartments, courtyards, kitchens, bathhouses, classrooms, nurseries, offices, guard posts. It functioned like a small city that happened to be sealed off from most men. And this is important. Most women in a medieval harem would never sleep with the ruler. Not once, not ever. The majority of women were attendants, servants, trainees, or simply residents. The idea that every woman was constantly competing for the ruler's attention is one of the biggest myths. Most days, the ruler was not even there. Daily life was structured. Wake up early, clean, attend lessons or assigned duties. Some women learned languages, others learned music, poetry, embroidery, calligraphy. Some cooked, some cleaned, some took care of children. Some worked in administration, managing supplies, schedules, or correspondence. The harem ran on organization, not chaos. And yes, there was hierarchy, always hierarchy. At the bottom were the newest arrivals, young girls who did not yet know the rules, who still cried at night, who still hoped someone might come for them. Above them were older women who had been there longer. They knew how to stay invisible, how to avoid trouble, how to keep their heads down. Then there were favored women, not necessarily lovers. Sometimes they were trusted companions, nurses, advisors, women who had survived long enough to become useful. And at the very top were women who had borne children, especially sons. Motherhood changed everything. If you had a child with the ruler, your status increased overnight. Your quarters improved, your food improved, your security improved. You had leverage now. Which sounds empowering until you remember that your safety was tied entirely to a child surviving palace politics. Infant mortality was high, child mortality was higher. Nothing was guaranteed. Women without children aged quietly. Some stayed their entire lives. Others were married off to officials or allies once they were no longer considered desirable or useful within the harem. This could be a blessing or a curse, depending on the match. Freedom was limited. The harem was guarded. Eunuchs often served as intermediaries, guards, and administrators. They enforced rules. They carried messages. They were powerful in their own way. And yes, they were often feared. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Many women formed deep friendships inside the harem. This was their world, their co-workers, their neighbors, their family, in a strange, enclosed sense. They celebrated small things together: a good meal, a successful performance, a child learning to walk. These moments mattered. Religion was a constant presence: daily prayers, rituals, instruction. Faith provided structure and meaning when personal control was limited. Some women leaned into it deeply. Others treated it more like a routine, but it filled the hours. And the hours were long. Most days were quiet, almost boring, waiting for instructions, waiting for visitors, waiting for news, waiting for aging to change their status, waiting for illness, waiting for death. This was not a life of constant drama. It was a life of slow accumulation. Let's float gently over to another reality check. Not all harems were the same. A harem in Abbasid Baghdad was not the same as one in Ottoman Istanbul. A harem in medieval Persia differed from one in Al-Andalus. Customs, scale, and power dynamics varied widely. Some harems were massive institutions with thousands of residents. Others were relatively small and intimate. In some places, women in the harem could influence politics significantly. Mothers of rulers, senior companions, educated women who understood court dynamics. They advised, they schemed, they negotiated, quietly, indirectly, carefully. Power was never straightforward, but it existed. In other places, women were far more isolated, cut off from news, from education, from meaningful agency. Their world shrank to walls and routines. Health was a constant concern. Disease spread easily in enclosed spaces. Childbirth was dangerous. Medical care existed, but it was limited. Women learned herbal remedies. Midwives became important figures. Survival required adaptability. And aging changed everything. Young girls arrived hopeful or terrified. Young women learned the rules. Middle-aged women became invisible. Older women became caretakers, advisors, or simply residents waiting out their time. There was no retirement plan, no pension, just continued existence. Some women eventually left, married, released, sent away. Others died inside the walls and were buried quietly, their names never recorded, their stories absorbed into the architecture. And yet, despite everything, these were not lives without meaning. Women laughed, they gossiped, they argued, they fell in love with each other sometimes. They told stories about where they came from. They remembered mothers, siblings, childhood homes. Memory became a form of freedom. The harem was not constant suffering. It was not constant pleasure. It was long, controlled, repetitive, human. So when you picture medieval harems, try not to imagine constant intrigue and luxury. Imagine hallways, courtyards at dawn, the sound of food, the quiet pressure of rules learned over years, the slow passing of time. In the next part, we'll drift closer to individual lives, women who rose unexpectedly, women who never did, women who became powerful without ever stepping outside the walls. For now, just let this settle. Breathe, and let the palace grow quiet again.
All right, settle back in. Same slow pace, same soft lighting. The palace is still there. Nothing urgent is happening, which, honestly, is most of the story. By the time a woman had spent a few years inside a medieval harem, something subtle usually happened. Not all at once, not dramatically. She stopped thinking of herself as someone who was temporarily there. The idea of leaving faded, not because it became impossible, but because imagining another life required energy she no longer wanted to spend. This is where survival shifted from fear to routine. The women who lasted were not the loud ones. They were not the most beautiful. They were not always the smartest either. They were the ones who learned how to stay, how to exist without being noticed too much, how to be useful without being threatening, which, historically speaking, is a very common survival skill. New arrivals often struggled with this. They cried, they asked questions, they broke rules without realizing there were rules. They made enemies by accident. The older women watched them with a mix of sympathy and distance. Everyone remembered being new. No one wanted to get involved. Training continued long after arrival. Education in the harem was practical. Languages were common, especially if the empire was multilingual. Music and poetry mattered, not because rulers were constantly requesting performances, but because cultured women reflected well on the institution itself. A refined harem was a status symbol. Some women learned accounting. Others learned how to manage household staff. Some became experts in ceremonial protocol. Who stands where? Who speaks first? Who pretends not to hear certain things? These skills were not glamorous, but they were valuable. And value was protection. The harem functioned on quiet labor. Meals did not cook themselves. Children did not raise themselves. Clothes did not wash themselves. Someone tracked inventories. Someone scheduled baths. Someone knew which woman needed which medicine. It was not chaos. It was administration. There was also boredom, long stretches of it. Hours passed slowly. Days blurred together. Women filled time with conversation, prayer, craft work, repetition. Storytelling was common. So was gossip. Gossip was information. Who was favored? Who was sick? Who was pregnant? Who had angered whom? Knowing these things helped women adjust their behavior accordingly. And then there was the ruler, the distant figure around whom everything revolved. Many women saw him rarely. Some never saw him at all. He existed more as a concept than a presence. Decisions attributed to him arrived through intermediaries. His moods were discussed, analyzed, guessed at. Women learned when to expect visits and when not to. The unpredictability was part of the power. When a woman was summoned, it was rarely sudden. There was preparation, bathing, dressing, instruction, sometimes nerves, sometimes resignation, sometimes hope. The encounter itself, when it happened, was not romantic. It was formal, controlled, brief, and afterward, life resumed. If no child resulted, the woman returned to her previous status. If a child did result, everything changed. But pregnancy was dangerous, childbirth even more so. Many women did not survive it. Others lost infants. Grief was common, but private. Public grief was discouraged. The palace did not stop for loss. Women who bore daughters were respected, but not elevated. Women who bore sons gained security. But security came with pressure. Raising a son inside a palace meant navigating rivalries before the child could even speak. Other women noticed. Friendships shifted. Alliances formed and dissolved. The harem was not a constant battlefield, but it was never neutral. Everyone understood that proximity to power mattered, even if you never touched it directly. Now let's talk about the ones who aged. Aging in the harem was not dramatic. No sudden decline, no ceremonial removal, just a gradual shift in relevance. Younger women took over visible roles. Older women moved inward. They became caretakers, advisors, quiet fixtures. Some found comfort in this. The pressure eased, expectations lowered. Others struggled with invisibility, especially women who had once been noticed. The loss of attention could feel like a second captivity. Health issues accumulated: joint pain, vision loss, chronic illness. Medical knowledge existed, but it was inconsistent. Herbal remedies, massage, rest, sometimes prayer, sometimes nothing. Older women often took on teaching roles, passing down skills, explaining rules, warning newcomers about mistakes to avoid. In this way, the harem became generational. Knowledge survived even when individuals did not. And then there were the exits. Some women were married off. This usually happened when they were no longer considered suitable for palace life, but still valuable as political or social assets. Being married to an official could mean relative comfort or complete misery. It depended entirely on the match. Others were released. This was rare, but not unheard of. Release often came with restrictions: where they could live, who they could marry, what they could say. Freedom came with conditions. Many women never left. They died inside the walls. Their deaths were marked quietly, rituals performed, bodies prepared, burials conducted without ceremony. The palace continued functioning as if nothing had happened. It sounds bleak, and parts of it were, but it is important to resist the urge to flatten these lives into pure suffering. Women laughed. They argued over trivial things. They teased each other. They developed inside jokes that made no sense to anyone outside the walls. They celebrated religious holidays. They took pride in well-run routines. They found meaning in small victories. And sometimes, very quietly, they found love. Not always romantic, often deep friendship, sometimes between women, sometimes maternal bonds with children that were not biologically theirs. These relationships mattered. Let's float gently to a misconception that needs addressing: the idea that women in harems were constantly jealous and plotting against each other. Competition existed, yes, especially around childbearing, but constant hostility would have made daily life unbearable. Cooperation was necessary. Trust was selective but real. Survival depended on it. Many women preferred stability over ambition. Being left alone was often the goal. Not advancement, not power, just peace. And then there were the rare exceptions, the ones who did gain influence. These women understood timing, silence, when to speak and when not to. They built relationships with administrators, eunuchs, tutors, and mothers of rulers. They gathered information slowly. They waited years to act. When they moved, it was subtle. A suggestion here, a recommendation there, a favor granted, a rival quietly sidelined. Power in the harem was rarely visible, but it existed. Still, even powerful women lived with uncertainty. Favor could vanish. A ruler could die. A son could fall ill. A new regime could sweep everything away overnight. Nothing was permanent. As the years passed, many women stopped measuring time in terms of before and after. Instead, life became seasonal: religious calendars, births, deaths, the arrival of new girls, the departure of old ones. This rhythm dulled sharp emotions. It made life bearable. So when we talk about medieval harems, we should talk about endurance, about adaptation, about quiet resilience. These were not passive figures frozen in time. They were people navigating constrained circumstances with limited options. In the next part, we'll drift toward specific historical settings, different regions, different customs, and how those differences shaped women's lives in subtle but important ways. For now, let the corridors echo softly.
All right, stay comfortable. Nothing sharp is coming, just more slow history, gently unfolding like a very long afternoon. By now, we have been floating around a general idea of the medieval harem. But one thing that matters, quietly but deeply, is location. Geography changed everything. Climate, religion, politics, scale, and yet somehow the emotional rhythm stayed remarkably similar. So let's drift across regions, not quickly, no maps needed, just vibes. Start with the large imperial harems, Abbasid Baghdad, Ottoman Istanbul, Safavid Persia. These were not private households, they were institutions, bureaucratic, layered, and constantly monitored. Thousands of women passed through over generations. Most were never remembered by name. A few became legends. In these massive harems, structure ruled everything. Women were categorized carefully. Rank determined clothing, food quality, living space, even how loudly you were allowed to exist. Senior women lived farther from entrances. New arrivals stayed closer to monitored zones. Movement was regulated, schedules mattered. And surveillance was constant, not dramatic, not paranoid, just constant. Eunuchs controlled access points, senior women reported problems, administrators tracked supplies. The goal was stability. Drama disrupted efficiency, and efficiency mattered more than feelings. Education in these settings was surprisingly broad. Many women learned to read and write. Some studied literature, theology, or philosophy at a basic level. This was not about empowerment in the modern sense. It was about refinement. A cultured harem reflected well on the ruler. Still, most women never used these skills outside the walls. Knowledge became another thing to pass time with, something to quietly take pride in. Now contrast that with smaller regional harems, provincial governors, local rulers, wealthy nobles. These harems were often much smaller, dozens of women instead of hundreds, fewer layers of hierarchy, more personal dynamics. In smaller harems, women interacted with the ruler more often, not necessarily romantically, just logistically. The ruler might pass through daily, might recognize faces, might remember names. This increased opportunity, but also risk. Visibility cuts both ways. Jealousies in these settings could feel sharper, fewer buffers, fewer places to hide. A single conflict could reshape the entire atmosphere. Still, even here, daily life was mostly routine. Meals, tasks, waiting. Now, let's slide west for a moment. Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Iberia, a place often romanticized to an almost embarrassing degree. Harems here blended influences. Muslim court traditions mixed with local customs. Women came from many backgrounds: Iberian, North African, Eastern European. Language barriers were common, so was cultural blending. Music and poetry were especially valued. Some women became renowned performers. A few even left written works behind, which is rare and important. These fragments remind us that some women were not just surviving, but creating. Still, the underlying structure remained: limited freedom, male authority, conditional security. And then there were frontier harems, border regions, recently conquered areas, politically unstable zones. These were often harsher environments, fewer resources, less protection, more uncertainty. Women here lived closer to danger. Raids, revolts, regime changes. A new ruler could arrive suddenly, bringing new rules. Old alliances dissolved quickly. Stability was fragile. For women in these settings, adaptability mattered even more. They learned to read moods, to stay flexible, to detach emotionally when needed. Hope was risky. Low expectations were safer. Now, let's talk about religion for a moment. Not theology, practice. Religion structured time: daily prayers, weekly gatherings, seasonal festivals. For many women, this was grounding, a reminder that life extended beyond palace walls, even if they never crossed them. Some women became deeply devout. Others treated rituals as habit. Either way, faith filled silence. It gave suffering context, or at least vocabulary. And yes, some women questioned it, quietly, internally. Doubt existed, but it was rarely expressed openly. Doubt was dangerous when your entire world was controlled by tradition. Now, something we have not lingered on enough of: children. Children were everywhere in harems: babies, toddlers, adolescents, sons of rulers, daughters of concubines, servants' children, orphans taken in. The harem was not child-free. It was loud at times, chaotic in small ways. Women without children often helped raise others. Wet nurses were respected. Caregivers formed strong bonds, sometimes stronger than biological ones. Children remembered the women who fed them, who comforted them, who taught them to speak. This mattered later. Some boys who became rulers remembered specific women fondly. They protected them, elevated them, listened to them. This is how influence sometimes worked, not through seduction, but through caregiving. Of course, this also meant risk. If a child fell out of favor, so did the women associated with them. Attachment was never safe. Now, let's gently address a myth that refuses to die: the idea that harems were sexually constant environments. They were not. Sex was regulated, scheduled, controlled. Access to the ruler was limited and deliberate. Most women lived celibate lives by default, not by choice, but by circumstance. This does not mean desire disappeared, it just got unacknowledged, unexpressed, or redirected. Emotional intimacy often replaced physical intimacy. Bonds formed quietly, privately, without language. And sometimes rules were broken. Secret relationships happened. Rarely, carefully, with enormous risk. Discovery meant punishment, exile, worse. Most women decided it was not worth it. So desire learned to stay quiet. Let's float toward aging again, but regionally. In large imperial harems, older women could gain surprising stability. Their experience made them valuable. They knew procedures, they remembered past rulers, they understood politics. Some became living archives. In smaller harems, aging could be vulnerability. Less protection, fewer roles. Women depended more on personal relationships or on marriage arrangements that arrived late and unwanted. Some women dreaded release. Freedom outside the palace could mean poverty, abuse, isolation. The palace, for all its limits, at least guaranteed food and shelter. This is one of the hardest things to sit with. Sometimes captivity felt safer than freedom. Now let's talk about names, or the lack thereof. Most women in harems lost their original names, or had them replaced. New names reflected beauty, virtue, flowers, jewels. Names were symbolic, not personal. Identity shifted. Some women embraced this. Reinvention was easier than clinging to a past that could not be retrieved. Others held their original names privately, whispered them in prayer, taught them to children in secret. Names mattered. They anchored memory. And memory was resistance. Across regions, across empires, across centuries, the emotional arc remained steady. Arrival, adjustment, routine, aging, uncertainty, survival. Some women experienced brief power, some never did. Most lived quiet lives that never made it into chronicles. And yet, these lives supported entire political systems. They raised rulers, managed households, preserved culture, maintained continuity. Without them, courts would have collapsed into chaos. So when we imagine medieval harems, we should imagine institutions built on women's invisible labor, not fantasy spaces, not prisons of constant misery, but controlled environments where human life unfolded slowly. In the next part, we will drift closer to individual stories, not necessarily famous ones necessarily, but representative ones, the kind that show how a single life could stretch across decades inside the same walls. For now, let the palace settle again. Courtyards cooling after sunset, lamps flickering, voices lowering, another day ending quietly, like most days in history always did.
Get comfortable again. Same pace,
same low energy. Nothing dramatic is about to happen, which is exactly the point. By the time a woman had spent 10, 20, sometimes 30 years inside a medieval harem, something curious happened to how she was perceived. She stopped being seen as a person who had arrived from somewhere else. She became part of the place itself, like a column or a doorway, always there, rarely questioned. These were the women who became furniture. They knew every corridor, every rule, every unspoken expectation. They knew which courtyards caught the morning sun and which stayed cold all year. They knew which officials were harmless and which ones remembered insults forever. They could predict tension days before anyone else noticed it. And because they knew so much, they were often ignored. New girls rarely noticed them at first. Young women tend to focus on what might happen next. Older women focused on what had already happened. That difference in orientation created distance. The older women watched, quietly. They did not intervene unless asked. Experience had taught them that advice was often wasted. These women woke early, earlier than required. Habits formed over decades are hard to break. They performed their tasks efficiently without fuss. They corrected mistakes gently, if at all. They did not seek praise. Praise attracted attention. Attention attracted expectations. Expectations were dangerous. Some of these women had once been favored, not necessarily romantically, but socially, trusted, consulted. They had seen their relevance fade gradually, not cruelly, just naturally. A younger generation arrived, tastes shifted, politics changed. There was rarely bitterness. Bitterness required energy. Most had learned to let go. They focused instead on continuity, making sure routines stayed intact, that meals happened on time, that children were supervised, that ceremonies did not fall apart. Stability was their contribution. In many harems, these women became informal historians. They remembered which woman came from where, which child belonged to whom, which ruler preferred which customs. Official records were inconsistent. Memory filled the gaps. Sometimes younger women sought them out, usually after making a mistake, or after losing favor, or after realizing that ambition had limits. These conversations happened quietly, in corners, during shared work. Advice was given without judgment. Stay where you are. Do not speak about that. Wait. Waiting was the most common advice. Let's talk about emotional management, because this was an unspoken skill. Women who survived long-term learned how to regulate their reactions. Outbursts were remembered, tears were noted, anger was dangerous, calm was safety, emotional flatness was protection. This did not mean they felt nothing, it meant they did not show it. Grief was internal, joy was subdued, fear was managed through routine. Emotional restraint became second nature, not because it was noble, but because it worked. This had long-term effects. Some women, when eventually released or married, struggled outside. Freedom required choices. Choices required emotional expression. They had not practiced that in decades. The palace trained compliance very effectively. Now let's gently drift into marriage, or what passed for it. When older women were married off, it was often transactional, a loyal official, a retired commander, a distant relative of someone important. These men expected obedience. They did not expect companionship. For women who had spent their lives in structured environments, marriage could be disorienting. Suddenly, there were fewer rules, but more personal danger. No guards, no community of women, no predictable routine. Some adjusted. Others longed for the palace, which sounds strange until you remember that familiarity often feels safer than autonomy. Women who stayed inside until death avoided this transition.
They remained in a world they understood, where food arrived, where rules were clear, where identity was fixed. Death inside the harem was quiet. Illness was handled discreetly. Other women filled in for duties. Prayers were said. When death came, the body was prepared respectfully. Rituals were observed. Then life continued. Rooms were reassigned, belongings redistributed. Memory faded. It sounds cold. It was practical. Now let's talk about power again, but the boring kind. Older women often influenced things simply by being present. Their approval mattered. Their silence mattered. When they nodded, others felt reassured. When they frowned, people noticed. They did not issue orders. They shaped atmospheres. Some were consulted by eunuchs, others by tutors, others by the mothers of rulers. Their opinions carried weight because they had seen consequences play out over time. This kind of power was slow and fragile. It disappeared the moment someone decided it did not matter anymore. Still, for a while, it existed. Let's float toward one of the saddest patterns, the women who arrived too young. Girls brought into harems at 8, 9, 10 years old grew up entirely inside palace walls. They had no memory of another life, no comparison. The harem was reality. These women often adapted best, which is not comforting. They internalized rules easily. They did not resist. They did not mourn a lost past. They became excellent at palace life. But something else happened. When they aged, there was no alternative identity to fall back on. Leaving felt impossible. Marriage felt terrifying. The outside world was abstract. Some clung to younger women as substitutes for family. Some became overly rigid. Some struggled with anxiety they could not name. The palace gave them everything and took everything. Now let's address something quietly uncomfortable: consent. Women in medieval harems did not have meaningful sexual consent as we understand it today. Their bodies were part of political systems. This does not mean every encounter was violent or traumatic. It means choice was constrained. Some women navigated this pragmatically. Others dissociated. Others endured. Emotional responses varied widely. It is important not to flatten these experiences into one narrative. Human beings respond differently to limited agency. Some adapt, some resist internally, some break. The older women knew this. They did not judge. They had lived long enough to understand complexity. Now let's slow down even more. Late life. Women who reached old age inside harems often lived longer than women outside. Regular food, shelter, reduced physical labor, medical attention, however limited, was consistent. Their bodies aged, but they were not worn down by childbirth every year or field work. This is one of history's quiet ironies. Old women became caretakers of memories. They told stories to children about past rulers, about forgotten women, about mistakes that should not be repeated. These stories were not written down, they lived orally, and then they disappeared. Sometimes, very rarely, an older woman was remembered publicly: a patron of architecture, a religious benefactor, a political advisor. These names survived. Thousands of others did not. And yet, their lives shaped outcomes. Let's pause on that, because this is the core truth. Medieval harems were not footnotes. They were engines. Social, political, emotional engines. And women inside them did not live in constant drama. They lived in repetition, in adaptation, in waiting. They became furniture not because they were unimportant, but because systems depend on stability, and stability is quiet. In the next part, we will drift into moments of disruption, regime changes, new rulers, sudden collapses, and how women inside harems experienced upheaval when the walls they depended on began to shift. For now, let everything settle again. The lamps burn low, footsteps fade, Someone coughs softly in the distance. Another long day has passed, and tomorrow will look very much the same.
All right. Stay where you are. Nothing sudden. Just a slow shift in the air. The kind you only notice after it has already happened. For women inside medieval harems, stability was everything. Routine, predictability, the quiet comfort of knowing what tomorrow would look like. So when that stability cracked, it was never loud at first. It arrived as rumors, whispers, a change in how guards behaved, a delay in meals, a name that stopped being spoken. This is how upheaval entered the harem, not with explosions, with uncertainty. Political change almost always reached the women's quarters last. Wars happened outside. Coups happened in council rooms. Assassinations happened in corridors they were not allowed to walk through. Inside the harem, life continued, until it didn't. Sometimes the first sign was administrative, a new official replacing an old one, a different eunuch delivering messages, new rules posted quietly, restrictions tightened or loosened, no explanation offered. Women noticed everything. They noticed when servants whispered more than usual, when senior women grew silent, when children were suddenly kept indoors, when prayer schedules shifted. These details mattered. They were indicators. If a ruler fell from power, the harem became a waiting room. No one knew what would happen next. Would they be preserved, transferred, disbanded, punished, forgotten? It depended entirely on the new regime. And the waiting was the worst part. Sometimes nothing happened at all. A new ruler arrived and kept the harem intact. Same women, same routines, a quiet continuity. This was the best-case scenario. Boring, safe, predictable. Other times, everything changed. Women associated with the previous ruler were suddenly liabilities, especially mothers of sons who might be seen as rivals. These women lived with constant anxiety. They understood politics well enough to know that motherhood could become dangerous overnight. Some were moved, confined, separated from their children. Others were married off quickly, exiled under polite language, rarely quietly executed. Not publicly, the palace preferred discretion. But even then, violence was not constant. More often there was administrative erasure. A woman stopped receiving visitors. Her name stopped appearing on lists. Her room was reassigned. She still lived. She just no longer mattered. For women lower in the hierarchy, regime change was confusing more than terrifying. New rules meant relearning routines, new expectations, new ways to stay invisible. They adapted, because adaptation was muscle memory by now. Now let's talk about conquest. When a city fell, harems were often seized intact. The women inside became assets, transferred to the new ruler's household, renamed, reclassified, folded into a different system. This was not uncommon. Empires absorbed harems like they absorbed treasuries. For women, this meant starting over without leaving the walls. New language, new customs, new hierarchy, new risks. Trauma did not come from physical movement, but from social displacement. Some women thrived in these transitions. They were flexible, observant, quick learners. Others struggled. Depression was common, though it had no name. Withdrawal, silence, loss of appetite. These were noticed, but rarely addressed. Mental health was not a concept. Functionality was. Children suffered in their own way. A boy raised to believe he was important might suddenly find himself irrelevant or dangerous. Mothers clung tightly. Others distanced themselves deliberately. Emotional self-protection became necessary. Now let's drift towards succession, one of the most delicate moments in palace life. When a ruler died, the harem entered limbo. Mourning rituals were observed. Women dressed appropriately. Prayers were said. But beneath the surface, calculation began. Who would inherit? Which mother would rise? Which would fall? Which alliances still mattered? Senior women moved carefully. They offered condolences without commitment. They avoided statements. Silence was strategic. If the successor was young, women gained time. Regency periods created opportunity. Mothers, nurses, tutors, and senior companions often held influence. Decisions were made quietly, behind the scenes, not publicly acknowledged, but real. If the successor was grown, things moved faster. Old structures were dismantled, new favorites appeared, older women were sidelined.
power shifted quickly. For women without connections, this meant another round of waiting, watching, adjusting. Now let's address the emotional toll of instability. Living decades inside a controlled environment created psychological dependence. The palace dictated food, shelter, identity. When that system wavered, anxiety surged. Women reported physical symptoms, headaches, stomach pain, insomnia. These were treated as physical ailments, herbs, rest, prayer. No one asked why they hurt. Some women became hyper-religious during uncertain times. Others withdrew completely. Others clung to routines even when they no longer made sense. Routine was control. Now let's gently acknowledge something else. Hope. Hope was dangerous in harems, but upheaval created cracks where hope slipped in. Maybe release, maybe marriage, maybe a new role, maybe escape. Most of these hopes went nowhere, but they existed, quietly, briefly. Some women prepared contingency plans, saving small items, jewelry, textiles, things that could be traded if needed. This was not rebellion, it was prudence. Others did nothing. Doing nothing was also a strategy. Now let's float toward one of the strangest outcomes of upheaval: nostalgia. Women who lived through multiple regimes often idealized earlier periods, even if those periods had been difficult. Memory softened edges. Past rulers became kinder in hindsight, past routines more stable. This nostalgia bonded women, shared stories of how things used to be, even if those stories were selective, even if they omitted fear. Memory became comfort. And then there were the women who disappeared from records entirely during upheaval, not because they died, but because no one bothered to document them anymore. When administrations changed, records were lost, names vanished, history forgot them first. Now let's slow down and talk about resilience. Real resilience, not the inspirational kind, the practical kind. Resilience looked like adjusting posture when new guards arrived. It looked like changing speech patterns to match new expectations. It looked like relearning which jokes were safe, which topics were forbidden. Resilience was not loud, it was subtle. Women who survived upheaval rarely talked about it afterwards. They folded it into their sense of normal. Instability became another layer of routine. Now let's touch on release again in the context of collapse. When empires weakened, resources shrank. Maintaining large harems became expensive. Some women were released en masse, given small stipends, told to fend for themselves. This was freedom without preparation. Some found families, some married, some joined religious institutions, some disappeared into poverty. The transition was brutal. Many women longed for the predictability they had lost. Again, captivity and safety were not opposites, they overlapped. Now let's pause on something uncomfortable but necessary. Survival sometimes required complicity. Women sometimes aligned with new regimes at the expense of others. They distanced themselves from old allies. They offered information. They adapted loyalties. This was not betrayal in the modern moral sense. It was survival. Judging these choices from a distance misses the point. Options were limited. Consequences were real. Now let the pace slow again. Upheaval did not last forever. Eventually, new routines formed. New hierarchies stabilized. The palace returned to its quiet hum. Women adjusted. They always did. The walls might shift, but they remained. And for many women, this was life. A series of slow adaptations inside spaces that rarely asked what they wanted, only what they could endure. In the next part, we will drift toward the rare women who left some kind of mark, not necessarily famous, but visible, the ones whose names survived, and what that survival cost them. For now, breathe. The palace settles again. Guards return to predictable paths. Lamps are lit at the usual hour. Somewhere inside, a woman realizes she has survived another change, and tomorrow she will wake up and continue.
All right. You're still here. The palace is still standing. The lamps are still low. Tonight, we drift toward the women who did something unusual without ever intending to be remarkable. The ones whose names survived, not because history was kind, but because circumstance accidentally preserved them. And right away, let's be clear. For every named woman we remember, there were thousands we never will. Survival in the records was not merit-based, it was proximity-based.
timing-based, occasionally luck-based, mostly arbitrary. But the women whose names endured give us something rare: texture. These women were not always powerful. Many started exactly like everyone else, young, displaced, observed, evaluated, assigned a place. What separated them later was not ambition alone, it was longevity, timing, and the ability to remain useful to the right people for a very long time. Let's begin with mothers, because motherhood was the most reliable way to enter history. A woman who bore a future ruler instantly gained narrative importance. Chroniclers cared about lineage, succession, bloodlines. Suddenly, her name mattered, or at least a version of it did, often modified, sometimes replaced entirely. These women did not automatically become powerful. They became relevant, which is different. A mother of a prince lived with constant pressure. Every illness mattered. Every rumor mattered. She learned restraint quickly. Overprotectiveness could be interpreted as ambition. Detachment could be read as weakness. Balance was everything. Some mothers mastered this. They positioned themselves as calm, pious, non-threatening, deeply loyal to the system. This made them acceptable, safe. Others leaned into influence, carefully. They built networks among tutors, administrators, and senior women. They shaped education. They nudged decisions. They protected their children quietly. When their sons rose, these women rose with them. Titles followed, respect followed, sometimes real authority followed. But it was fragile. If a son died young, the mother fell instantly. Her status evaporated. Her name slipped back toward obscurity. Now let's float to another category, the senior companions. These women were not mothers of rulers. They were trusted presences, advisors, confidants, emotional anchors, often older, often highly educated, often deeply familiar with court politics. They listened more than they spoke, which made rulers trust them. Some advised on personal matters, others on ceremonial ones. Some mediated conflicts, some softened bad news. Their influence was subtle, almost invisible, which made it last. A few of these women appear in records as patrons, builders of mosques, sponsors of schools, donors to religious institutions. This was one of the safest ways to leave a mark. Piety was respected. Charity was praised. It framed influence as virtue. Behind the scenes, these acts also secured loyalty. Clerics remembered donors. Communities protected benefactors. Reputation extended beyond palace walls. These women understood legacy better than most men. Now let's talk about a different survival path: talent. Some women were exceptional musicians, poets, calligraphers, storytellers. Their skills were rare enough to be documented, their performances noted, their verses copied. In Al-Andalus and Abbasid courts especially, cultured women could become minor celebrities within elite circles. Their names appeared in literary anthologies, marginal notes, biographical dictionaries. This was not fame in the modern sense, it was preservation. Still, talent alone was not enough. These women had to navigate attention carefully. Admiration could turn into resentment. Visibility could invite control. Many deliberately limited their exposure, performed selectively, spoke cautiously, maintained reputations for modesty. Talent was safest when framed as service. Now let's gently address something else: myth-making. Some women's stories were reshaped after their deaths, sanitized, romanticized, simplified. A politically astute woman became devoted. A pragmatic survivor became virtuous. A strategic advisor became selfless. This made their stories palatable. Real complexity was uncomfortable, so chroniclers smoothed edges, which means that even remembered women are partially fictionalized. But fragments remain, small contradictions, hints of agency, evidence of calculation. Those hints matter. Now let's drift toward women who ruled indirectly. Regents, queen mothers, guardians of child rulers. These women often wielded real power, issuing orders, appointing officials, managing resources, all while officially acting on behalf of someone else. Their authority was temporary by design, which made them vulnerable. Once the child ruler came of age, they were expected to step back gracefully. Not all did. Some succeeded, others were pushed aside. Some were accused of overreach or manipulation or ambition, which were coded criticisms, gendered criticisms. Their legacies were contested, praised by some, condemned by others. This tension is often visible in records, which is itself evidence of influence. People do not argue about irrelevant figures. Now let's talk about the cost of being remembered. Women whose names survived rarely lived peaceful lives. Attention brought scrutiny, influence brought enemies, documentation brought judgment. Their private lives were dissected, their motives questioned, their emotions interpreted through moral frameworks they did not choose. Being remembered meant losing privacy permanently. Many unnamed women likely lived quieter, steadier lives, less pressure, less danger, less narrative distortion. So survival in history is not inherently a reward. Now let's float towards something subtle, silence as legacy. Some women deliberately avoided leaving traces. They did not sponsor buildings, they did not cultivate chroniclers, they did not attach themselves to institutions. They focused on immediate survival, on relationships, on day-to-day stability. Their legacy existed only in memory, in children they raised, in routines they maintained, in advice passed quietly from one woman to another. This legacy died with witnesses, but it mattered just as much. Now let's pause on something that rarely gets acknowledged: emotional labor. Women whose names survived often acted as emotional stabilizers for rulers, for courts, for households. They absorbed anxiety, smoothed tensions, maintained appearances. This labor was invisible but essential. It kept systems functioning. History rarely records emotional work, but without it, chaos follows. Now let's slow down again. Imagine a woman near the end of her life. She has lived through multiple rulers, multiple upheavals. She has seen women arrive terrified and leave transformed. She has watched children grow into adults who barely recognize her. She is remembered, or she is not. At this point, it hardly matters. What matters is that she endured. She adapted to systems she did not design. She navigated power without formal authority. She learned restraint when expression was dangerous. She found meaning in limited spaces. Her life was not extraordinary, and that is exactly why it matters. The women whose names survived give us entry points, but they are not the story. They are windows. In the next part, we will drift toward endings. Not dramatic endings, just what happened when life inside the harem finally stopped, how women faced old age, illness, release, and death. For now, let the palace grow quieter, footsteps slow, conversations taper off. Somewhere, a woman whose name might appear in a footnote one day closes her eyes, and the system continues around her, indifferent, steady, and very, very old.
Settle in again. This part is not heavy, just quiet. Endings in medieval harems were rarely dramatic. They did not arrive with speeches or realizations. They arrived slowly, like fatigue. For most women, there was no clear final chapter. Life simply narrowed. As women aged, their world became smaller. Fewer duties, shorter walks, longer rests. They moved less, spoke less, observed more. Not because they were ordered to, but because energy fades and priorities change. Old age inside the harem was oddly stable. Food still arrived. Shelter was guaranteed. There was no need to labor physically. Compared to women outside palace walls, many lived longer. Their bodies aged, but they were not worn down by endless childbirth or agricultural work. This was one of history's uncomfortable trade-offs. Constraint came with care. Illness, when it came, was treated practically. Herbal mixtures, warm compresses, massage, prayer. If the woman was respected, attendance stayed close. If she was forgotten, care was minimal but present. No one expected recovery from old age. The goal was comfort, or at least quiet. Women nearing the end often withdrew socially, not out of sadness, but out of habit. They had learned not to take up space. They spent time with a small circle, or alone, or with children if they were still involved in caregiving. Some women reflected on their lives, others didn't. Reflection was a luxury. Many simply accepted that this was how life had unfolded. Not good, not bad, just complete. Death inside the harem was anticipated, not feared. When a woman died, there was no chaos. Her body was prepared according to custom. Rituals were observed. Prayers were said. Other women paused their routines briefly, then resumed them. Rooms were reassigned quickly, belongings distributed. Memory faded faster than you might expect. This sounds cold, but it was also humane in its own way. Death was normalized, not hidden, not dramatized. It was part of the rhythm. Now let's talk about release again, because not all endings happened inside. Some women were released late in life, sometimes as acts of charity, sometimes because the harem was shrinking, sometimes because a new ruler wanted to reorganize everything. Release came with mixed emotions: relief, fear, confusion. Women who had spent decades inside palace walls often felt unprepared for the outside world. They did not know how to negotiate prices or manage households independently or navigate male-dominated public spaces. Some returned to families, if families still existed. Others joined religious institutions, convents, retreats, hospices. These places offered structure similar to what they knew. A few married late. These marriages were rarely romantic. They were arrangements, companionship of a sort, or mutual convenience. Freedom was not always kinder than captivity. Now let's pause on the idea of regret. Did women regret their lives in harems? Some probably did. Others likely did not frame their experiences that way. Regret implies alternative choices. Many never had those. Instead, they measured life by endurance, by survival, by moments of connection, by children raised, by crises avoided. Meaning was contextual. Some women felt pride in having navigated palace politics successfully, in having protected children, in having outlived rivals, in having remained stable. Others felt emptiness, a sense that life had happened around them, not through them. This emotional range existed quietly, rarely spoken aloud. Now let's talk about memory, or lack of it. Most women were not remembered by name. Their existence is inferred from records of expenses, from architectural plans, from mentions of women's quarters without detail. They are present in absence. Occasionally, a document mentions an old woman who served faithfully for decades, or a caretaker who raised multiple generations. These references are brief, functional, almost affectionate. These moments are rare, but they matter. They tell us that even in systems built on control, individuals were noticed, sometimes. Now let's drift towards something more abstract: legacy. What did these women leave behind? They left routines, institutional memory, cultural practices, songs, stories, religious habits. They shaped court culture quietly. They influenced how rulers understood domestic life, how children understood authority, how future harems were structured. Their impact was diffuse, hard to trace, but real.
Now let's address one more myth gently. The idea that these women were either victims or manipulators. They were neither exclusively. They were people operating within constrained systems, making choices where possible, enduring where necessary, sometimes benefiting, sometimes suffering, often both. Flattening them into archetypes erases complexity. History is quieter than that. Now imagine a final scene, not cinematic, just ordinary. An older woman sits in a familiar courtyard, the same one she has seen for decades. The stone is worn smooth, the air smells faintly of water and dust. She listens to younger women talking. Their voices are brighter, their concerns feel urgent. She recognizes herself in them, vaguely. She does not interrupt. Advice is rarely wanted until it's too late. She closes her eyes, not because she is sad, because rest feels good. This is how many lives ended, not with resolution, but with familiarity. Now let's step back, far back. When we talk about medieval harems, we often search for spectacle, drama, intrigue, power struggles, romance. But most of the truth lives elsewhere, in repetition, in waiting, in adaptation. Women sold into medieval harems did not live lives of constant misery or constant luxury. They lived long lives inside systems that limited movement but provided structure. They were constrained, they were resilient, they were human. And most importantly, they were numerous. History remembers the loudest figures, but history was built by people who stayed quiet long enough to survive. In the final part, we will pull all of this together gently, not with conclusions, just with perspective, how these lives fit into the broader human story, and why they still matter, even when they refuse to be dramatic. For now, rest. The palace is quiet again. Lamps are low. Another woman's life has ended without ceremony, and the world, as it always does, continues forward at the same unhurried pace.
All right, you made it this far. Get a little more comfortable if you need to. This part stretches out. No rush, nothing to remember for later. Just let it move past you. By now, it should be clear that medieval harems were not really about pleasure, or excess, or fantasy. Those ideas were added later by people looking in from the outside, trying to make sense of something they did not live through. At their core, harems were about control. Not always cruelty, not always violence, just control. Of space, of bodies, of lineage, of uncertainty. And for the women inside them, life became a long exercise in managing that control without ever holding it. Most women entered harems without ceremony. They left, if they left at all, without ceremony. Their lives did not follow arcs, they followed loops. Wake, work, wait, adjust, repeat. This is uncomfortable for modern storytelling. We like progress, transformation, clear endings. Medieval harem life offers none of that. It offers endurance, which is why it feels sleepy when told honestly. Women sold into harems were rarely chosen for who they were. They were chosen for what they represented: youth, beauty, fertility, status, political exchange. Their individuality mattered less than their category. And yet individuality never fully disappeared. Even inside the strictest systems, women carved out personal identities. Through friendships, through routines, through habits so small no one bothered to control them. The way they tied their hair, the prayers they favored, the stories they repeated. These things mattered. One woman might be known for calming children, another for knowing remedies, another for remembering dates and names, another for singing softly at night. These reputations gave meaning. Meaning did not come from freedom, it came from usefulness. This is another uncomfortable truth. Being useful was safer than being desired. Desire faded, usefulness endured. So women learned skills, learned people, learned timing, learned restraint. These were not passive traits, they were active adaptations. Now let's step back even further. Why did harems exist at all? They existed because elite men wanted certainty.
certainty of lineage, certainty of loyalty, certainty that heirs came from controlled environments. The harem was a solution to anxiety, and women paid the price for that solution. But not in a single dramatic way, in thousands of small, ordinary ways. Missed childhoods, lost languages, forgotten names, emotional flattening. These losses did not register as tragedy in chronicles. They registered as normal. Normal is where most suffering hides. It is tempting to frame these women as tragic figures, and some lives were tragic, but tragedy implies exception. These lives were systems, designed, maintained, repeated. That repetition matters. Now let's talk about comparison, because it matters too. Life outside the harem was not necessarily better. Most medieval women lived hard lives: early marriage, frequent childbirth, physical labor, exposure to disease, legal vulnerability, hunger, violence, early death. Women inside harems avoided some of this. They had food, shelter, medical attention, fewer pregnancies for most, longer lifespans. They traded one set of risks for another: physical hardship for psychological constraint, public vulnerability for private control. This does not make harems benevolent, it makes them complicated. History rarely gives clean villains. Now let's sit with something quieter: time. Time inside a harem moved differently, without seasons of planting and harvest, without public festivals, without travel. Time was marked internally, by births, by deaths, by arrivals, by changes in hierarchy. Days blurred, years blurred. Women aged without milestones. This altered how women understood themselves. Identity became less about progression and more about continuity, being the same person in the same place for a long time. This can dull ambition, but it can also deepen patience. Now let's touch on resistance, because people always ask about it. There were rebellions, rare, risky, usually unsuccessful. Small acts of defiance existed: refusals, sabotage, silence, withholding information. These acts mattered emotionally, if not politically. But most resistance looked like adaptation, which frustrates modern audiences. Adaptation feels like surrender. But inside systems with few exits, adaptation is survival. Judging these women for not resisting loudly misunderstands the cost. Now let's address how later history treated these lives. European writers exoticized harems, sexualized them, flattened women into props. This said more about European anxieties than about reality. Later nationalist histories erased women entirely, reduced harems to footnotes. Domestic spaces were considered irrelevant to real history. Both approaches missed the point. Harems were central to governance, to succession, to diplomacy, to culture. Ignoring them distorts history, and ignoring the women inside them distorts humanity. Now imagine for a moment a single life stretched across this system. A girl arrives at 12, confused, afraid. She learns the rules, learns the language, learns when to speak. She makes friends, loses them, ages, becomes reliable, becomes invisible, becomes respected quietly. She raises children who are not hers. She watches rulers rise and fall. She survives illness. She outlives people who once terrified her. She dies in the same place she arrived, decades later. A long loop completed. Is this a wasted life? That depends entirely on how we define value. Modern values emphasize choice, autonomy, expression. Medieval systems did not. Judging medieval lives exclusively by modern standards erases historical context. These women did not choose their circumstances, but they chose how to endure them. Endurance is not glamorous, but it is human. Now let's talk about why this story still matters. Because systems that confine people quietly still exist. Not harems, but institutions, workplaces, social roles, expectations. People still trade freedom for security, still adapt instead of rebel, still live long, quiet lives inside constraints. Understanding medieval harems helps us recognize these patterns, not to excuse them, but to see them clearly. History does not repeat, but it rhymes softly. Now let's slow everything down. There is no final lesson here, no takeaway, no moral neatly tied up, just a recognition. Women sold into medieval harems were not symbols, they were not fantasies, they were not footnotes. They were people whose lives unfolded slowly inside controlled spaces. Their stories resist excitement, they resist drama, they resist simplification, which is exactly why they deserve to be told this way, calmly, patiently, without spectacle. So if you are still listening, half awake, letting this drift past you, that is appropriate. This history is not meant to shock you awake. It is meant to settle in quietly, like the lives it describes. In the next and final part, we will close the door gently, not with conclusions, just with silence, and with the understanding that most of history lived and died without ever asking to be remembered. For now, rest. The palace is still. The walls are old. Somewhere, another woman adjusts to another day exactly like the one before it. And history moves forward softly, carried by people who were never meant to be seen.
All right. This is the part where things slow down even more. If you've been drifting in and out, that's fine. This section exists in that half-awake space anyway. By the time the harem door closed behind a woman for the last time, whether through death, release, or quiet disappearance, the system barely noticed. Which sounds cruel, but it's also how large systems survive. They do not pause for individuals, they absorb them. Then they move on. And yet, something lingered. Not in records, not in architecture, but in habits, in expectations, in how power was exercised long after these women were gone. Because harems were not just places where women lived, they were places where rulers learned how to rule. Most elite men who grew up around harems learned early lessons about authority, about silence, about obedience, about emotional containment, about how entire groups of people could be managed without overt violence simply through routine and structure. This mattered. A boy raised among women who had learned restraint did not grow up seeing resistance as normal. He grew up seeing adaptation, quiet compliance, emotional discipline. That shaped governance. So even when women disappeared from view, their influence remained embedded in political culture. Now let's drift towards something subtle, memory outside the walls. Occasionally, a woman who left the harem returned to society carrying invisible habits. She spoke softly, avoided direct conflict, deferred instinctively, managed households efficiently, understood hierarchy intuitively. People noticed without understanding why. Former harem women were sometimes described as calm, reserved, controlled, which could be praised or distrusted. Calm women were often seen as hiding something. Their experiences did not translate easily into public narratives. There was no socially acceptable way to talk about decades spent inside controlled domestic systems. Silence followed them out. And silence can be isolating. Now let's talk about families, or the absence of them. Women sold into harems often lost contact with their families permanently. Names changed, locations changed, time passed. Even if they were released later, reconnecting was difficult. Families moved, died, changed. Returned daughters felt like strangers. Languages shifted. Customs felt unfamiliar. The woman who returned was not the girl who left. This created another quiet grief, one that did not look like loss, but like disconnection. Some women did not even try to return. They built new identities where they were: religious institutions, new marriages, small communities. Starting over was easier than revisiting a past that no longer existed.
Now let's float toward legacy again, but this time the unintended kind. The presence of harems shaped art, architecture, literature, music. Entire aesthetic traditions developed around these enclosed spaces. Courtyards, latticed windows, gardens designed for privacy, soundscapes meant to soothe. Women lived inside these designs daily. They shaped how space was used, which areas felt safe, which felt exposed. Their preferences influenced architecture quietly. Even today, traces remain, not of individual women, but of the environments built around their lives. Now let's pause on something uncomfortable again. Internalization. Years of living under controlled systems changed how women thought about themselves. Some internalized hierarchy deeply. They believed they deserved their position, or that questioning it was dangerous. Others maintained internal resistance, private narratives that reframed their experiences. Humor, sarcasm, spiritual meaning, emotional detachment. Both responses were adaptive. Psychological survival does not follow a single path. Now let's talk about storytelling, or rather the lack of it. Women inside harems rarely told their own stories publicly. Literacy did not guarantee authorship. Publishing was not accessible. Speaking openly was risky. So others told stories for them. Men, outsiders, later historians. These stories often reflected external fantasies more than lived realities. Sexual intrigue dominated. Quiet endurance bored audiences. Which is why modern retellings still struggle to sit with this topic calmly. People want excitement. This history refuses to provide it. Now let's sit with boredom for a moment, because boredom is actually important here. Boredom was not accidental. It was structural. A bored population is predictable, calm, manageable. Harems were designed to minimize stimulation, reduce conflict, maintain order. Women filled boredom with routine, craftwork, conversation, prayer, caregiving. These activities were not meaningless, they were coping mechanisms. But boredom still shaped psychology. It slowed ambition, flattened emotion, made days interchangeable. This is one of the hardest aspects to communicate, because boredom does not photograph well. It does not dramatize easily. Yet, it defined daily life more than fear or desire. Now let's drift toward comparison again, because context matters. Women in monasteries experienced similar rhythms: enclosure, routine, limited contact with the outside world, emphasis on obedience, emotional restraint. The difference was consent and ideology, but even there, consent was often shaped by family pressure and economic necessity. Medieval life rarely offered clean choices, which reminds us that harems were part of a broader pattern, institutions that managed women's lives for social stability. Understanding harems helps us understand monasteries, households, courts, even modern bureaucracies. Patterns repeat quietly. Now imagine a historian centuries later trying to reconstruct these lives. They have fragments, payment lists, architectural plans, passing mentions, maybe a poem, maybe a donor inscription, maybe a complaint in a court record. They fill gaps with imagination, sometimes responsibly, sometimes not. But no matter how careful they are, most experiences remain inaccessible. Sensations, emotions, thoughts that were never recorded. This absence is frustrating, but it is also honest. History does not owe us completeness. Now let's slow everything down again. Think of a single afternoon inside a medieval harem. Not a dramatic one, just an ordinary one. Light filters through a courtyard. Someone is sewing. Someone else is reciting something softly. A child laughs, then is quieted. Footsteps pass. Water flows. Time stretches. Nothing happens. And that nothing is the point. Most human lives are built from days like that, days without significance, without turning points, without narrative value. History tends to erase those days, but those days are where life actually happens.
Women sold into medieval harems lived thousands of those days. Their lives were not summarized by arrival or departure. They were made of middles, long middles. Now let's address one final misunderstanding, that endurance equals passivity. Endurance requires constant adjustment, emotional regulation, social awareness, self-control. These are active processes, exhausting ones. Endurance is work. So when we imagine these women as passive figures waiting for something to happen, we miss the effort involved in simply existing within constraints. They worked to stay safe, worked to remain useful, worked to avoid harm, worked to maintain internal equilibrium. That work deserves recognition, even if it left no visible mark. Now let's prepare to close the door, slowly, no final words needed. The palace does not collapse, the system does not end. Another generation arrives, another generation adapts, the cycle continues, and history moves on, carrying very little with it. But for a while, if you sit with this story quietly, those women exist again, not as fantasies, not as symbols, just as people, living long, controlled, ordinary lives. That is enough. Rest. The lamps are low, the corridors are quiet. Somewhere far back in time, a woman who was never named finishes another day and goes to sleep, unaware that centuries later, someone would be listening to her life drift past them gently in the dark.
All right. This is where everything becomes very soft around the edges. If you've been half asleep already, this part won't wake you up. It's mostly about what lingers after lives like these fade from view. The echo, not the sound. By the time medieval harems began to shrink, transform, or disappear entirely, most of the women who had lived inside them were already gone. Not dramatically gone, just finished. Their lives had ended the way they were lived, quietly, internally, without anyone feeling the need to announce it. Institutions rarely mourn individuals. As empires shifted, so did domestic structures. Harems changed shape. Some were reduced to smaller households. Others were reorganized under new political ideologies. Some were rebranded under modern terminology that sounded cleaner, more administrative, less emotional. But the habits remained. The separation of space, the management of women's lives through routine, the belief that stability mattered more than autonomy. Those ideas did not vanish with architecture. They softened, they blended, they moved into new forms. And the women who once lived inside harems never got credit for shaping those habits, because shaping habits does not look like action. It looks like consistency. Now let's drift into a strange truth. Most people living after the medieval period did not think much about harems at all. They were background, familiar, unremarkable. When something is normal, it does not feel historical. For the women inside, life did not feel like participation in a grand system. It felt like getting through the day, avoiding mistakes, remembering rules, managing relationships, hoping for stability. History happened around them, not through them. And yet when those systems eventually faded, the absence felt noticeable. Palaces felt emptier. Domestic rhythms changed. Courts felt less insulated. Power felt more exposed. The removal of enclosed domestic systems did not automatically lead to freedom. It led to uncertainty. Which brings us to an uncomfortable observation. Large systems often feel safer from the inside than from the outside, even when they are restrictive. Women who had lived entire lives within palace walls sometimes struggled deeply when those walls disappeared. There were no more prescribed hours, no fixed hierarchies, no guaranteed meals, no shared understanding of how to exist. Freedom requires navigation skills. Those skills are learned through practice.
Many never had the chance to practice them. So when later generations judged these women for not wanting freedom, they misunderstood what freedom demanded. Now let's slow down and look at legacy again, but not the kind written in books. What did these women pass down that cannot be measured? They passed down ways of managing boredom, ways of surviving long-term constraint, ways of forming community in enclosed spaces, ways of regulating emotion when expression is unsafe. These skills do not disappear, they migrate. You can see them later in monasteries, in factories, in boarding schools, in institutions where people live together under rules they did not create. History does not copy, it adapts. Now let's gently step into modern misunderstanding, because this story is often mishandled. Modern audiences want to rescue these women retroactively, to imagine dramatic escapes, to frame survival as resistance, to assign modern values to medieval lives. That impulse comes from empathy, but it also risks flattening complexity. Not every constrained life is waiting to be liberated. Some are waiting to be endured. That does not make the system good, it makes the people inside it realistic. Now imagine someone asking one of these women late in life whether she was happy. It's not a question she would recognize. Happiness implies comparison, alternative futures, personal fulfillment as a goal. Her metrics would be different. Was she safe? Was she fed? Did she belong somewhere? Did she avoid disgrace? Did she survive? By those measures, many would answer yes, and that answer would be honest. Now let's talk about storytelling fatigue, because this matters too. When historians try to write about harems responsibly, they often struggle with length, because nothing happens quickly, nothing resolves neatly, everything stretches. That makes it tempting to compress, to summarize decades into paragraphs, to jump from arrival to death in a few sentences. But compression distorts truth. The truth lives in the in-between, the long middle where nothing changes and everything slowly does, which is why this story takes time and why it sounds repetitive, because life was repetitive. Now let's float toward one more subtle effect: emotional flattening across generations. Children raised in these environments absorbed calm as a value, silence as virtue, control as safety, emotional restraint as intelligence. Those children became adults who governed with emotional distance, who preferred order over expression, who feared chaos more than cruelty. This shaped leadership styles, court cultures, even legal practices. Domestic environments teach political instincts. So the women inside harems influenced governance not by advising rulers, but by modeling emotional containment as normal. That influence is invisible, but profound. Now let's pause on grief, because grief in these spaces was quiet. Women grieved children who died, friends who vanished, youth that passed unnoticed. But grief was managed privately. Public mourning disrupted order. So grief learned to be small, internal, lingering. Unexpressed grief does not disappear, it settles, it becomes part of personality. This matters when we imagine these women as emotionally blank. They were not blank, they were contained. Now let's gently touch on love, because it existed, just not loudly. Love between women, deep, loyal, sustaining bonds. Maternal love extended beyond biology. Affection expressed through care, routine, protection. Romantic love existed too, occasionally, but it was fragile, dangerous, often brief. Love did not save anyone, but it made endurance easier. And endurance, again, was the goal. Now let's slow everything down even more. Imagine the very last woman who remembers the earliest days of a particular harem. She remembers when the walls were new, when certain traditions were just being established, when names now forgotten were still spoken daily. She is old, nearly invisible. Her memories have no audience. When she dies, a version of history dies with her. Not the official one, the lived one. And this happened again and again. History lost far more than it kept. Now let's talk about why telling this story matters, even without drama. Because it reminds us that power is often maintained through quiet systems, not spectacle. That control often looks like routine, that survival often looks boring, and because it challenges the idea that only visible action matters. Most human effort goes into staying afloat, not changing the tide. Women sold into medieval harems did that work every day, for centuries, across empires. Not loudly, not memorably, but consistently. Now we approach the end. Not an ending, just a gentle closing. There is no final image, no collapse, no liberation montage, just continuity. The doors open and close. New women arrive. Older women disappear. Routines persist. And history, as always, keeps moving forward without us waiting to notice. If you are listening to this as you fall asleep, that feels appropriate. These lives were not meant to keep you awake. They were meant to pass quietly, the way most lives do. And in that quiet, they become real again, not as myths, not as fantasies, just as people. Rest. The lamps dim, the corridors echo softly. Somewhere deep in the past, another ordinary day ends without comment. And that, more than anything, is what this story has always been about.
Okay, we're settling even deeper now. This is the part where the story barely moves forward at all, which honestly fits the subject perfectly. If your thoughts are drifting, let them. This section is built for that slow, foggy space right before sleep. By the late medieval period, harems had existed for so long that no one involved thought of them as inventions anymore. They were just there, like walls, like staircases, like gravity. You didn't question them, you navigated them. And the women inside did not spend their lives thinking, I am inside a historical institution. They thought about the temperature, the food, their aches, who was annoyed with whom, who had fallen out of favor, who was pregnant, who was ill, who needed help getting through the day. History has a way of pretending people lived symbolically. They didn't. They lived practically. Now let's slow down and talk about age, because age changes everything in these spaces. Young women arrived afraid, alert, emotionally raw. They watched closely, learned rules quickly. Mistakes were more dangerous early on, when attention was unavoidable. Middle-aged women faded into competence. They became fixtures, reliable, known, less scrutinized. Their value shifted from desirability to usefulness, which, ironically, often made life easier. Older women were ghosts. They moved freely because no one noticed them anymore. They knew everything, they spoke little, they had survived long enough to be uninteresting. This aging arc mattered more than rank. Because power inside a harem was not static, it evolved with time, relationships, and emotional intelligence. Not everyone wanted to rise. Rising meant visibility. Visibility meant risk. Some women chose stability over ambition, and they were often the wisest. Now let's drift into something rarely discussed: illness. Disease passed quietly through enclosed spaces. Fevers, infections, chronic pain, nutritional deficiencies, mental exhaustion. Most were treated with whatever knowledge was available. Sometimes that helped, sometimes it didn't. Ill women were not romanticized. They were inconveniences.
Weakness disrupted routine, and routine mattered. So sickness was endured privately. Complaints were minimized. Pain was normalized. A woman who could function while ill was praised. A woman who could not was quietly sidelined. This shaped how women understood their own bodies. Pain became background noise. Fatigue became normal. Health became something you noticed only when it failed completely. Now let's move toward another quiet truth. Many women inside harems never believed they were special, even those closest to power. From the outside, being chosen by a ruler looks exceptional. From the inside, it often felt temporary, replaceable, conditional. Affection could cool without explanation. Favor could shift overnight. Women learned not to build identity around attention. This prevented emotional collapse. It also flattened expectation. Hope was dangerous. Low expectations were safer. Now imagine a woman who had once been favored, later watching that favor transfer to someone younger. She does not rage. She does not rebel. She adjusts. She withdraws. She becomes quieter. That withdrawal was not defeat. It was survival. Now let's talk about competition. Because yes, rivalry existed, but not always in the way people imagine. Direct confrontation was rare, too risky. Instead, competition expressed itself through alliances, through information control, through emotional proximity, through usefulness. Who could soothe tensions? Who could manage others? Who could anticipate needs? These skills were subtle, hard to document, impossible to dramatize, but they determined daily safety. This made emotional intelligence a form of currency. And women who mastered it lived longer, calmer lives. Now let's gently step outside the palace again. How did the world imagine these women? Mostly wrong. Travelers wrote exaggerated accounts, artists painted fantasies, poets invented intrigue. None of it matched the quiet monotony of actual life. Sexualization became the dominant lens because it was easier, it was interesting, it sold stories. But sex was not central to daily life. Waiting was. Waiting for instructions, waiting for meals, waiting for visitors, waiting for permission, waiting for nothing in particular. Waiting reshapes time perception. Days stretch, years blur. Women stopped counting time in years and started counting it in routines. Now let's float toward religion, because faith played a complicated role. Religion provided structure, meaning, consolation, a sense of internal autonomy when external autonomy was limited. Prayer filled time, ritual marked days, moral frameworks explained suffering without requiring rebellion. But religion could also reinforce acceptance, teach endurance, normalize inequality. Both were true at once. Women used faith in practical ways, to cope, to bond, to explain, to forgive, to detach. Spiritual life was rarely dramatic. It was steady, repetitive, quiet, much like everything else. Now let's slow even more. Almost nothing is happening now, which is perfect. Imagine a woman late at night, after the lamps have dimmed. She sits alone briefly, not because she is lonely, but because solitude is rare. In that moment, she thinks of nothing in particular. Her mind wanders, to memories, to imagined alternatives, to sensations, to silence. These moments did not change history, but they were her life. Thousands of such moments existed, completely undocumented. Now let's touch on something uncomfortable again: emotional numbness. Long-term constraint often produces emotional dampening, not emptiness, just reduced intensity. This protected women from despair. It also limited joy. Extreme highs and lows were dangerous. Balance was survival. So emotions became muted, measured, internal. From the outside, this looks like passivity. From the inside, it feels like control. Now let's talk about release. Not freedom, release. Some women left harems through marriage, through reassignment, through religious retirement, through death of patrons, through institutional change. Leaving was not always celebrated, it was disorienting. Suddenly there were choices, consequences, responsibilities without guidance. Many struggled, some longed for the predictability they had lost, which complicates modern assumptions about liberation. Freedom is not inherently comforting, it requires practice. Now let's drift toward another generational continuity. Women taught newcomers quietly, not formally, through example, through correction, through modeling acceptable behavior. Rules were rarely written, they were absorbed. This created a culture that outlasted individuals. Even when leadership changed, even when empires shifted, the internal rhythm remained. Because culture is harder to dismantle than architecture. Now let's address one last myth, that these women lived lives without meaning. Meaning is not always loud. It does not always involve achievement. Sometimes it involves maintaining equilibrium. Meaning can be found in care, in stability, in preventing harm, in sustaining others. Many women found meaning in these roles, not because they were ideal, but because humans seek meaning wherever they are. Now we begin to drift toward the end of this part. No conclusion, just a soft taper. History did not record most of these lives because history prioritizes change. These lives prioritized continuity. They were not designed to be remembered, they were designed to function. And they did. For centuries. So if this story feels slow, repetitive, almost uneventful, that is not a flaw, it is accuracy. The past was not a highlight reel, it was a long, quiet stretch of ordinary endurance. And tonight, as you listen, that endurance echoes softly, not asking for judgment, not asking for rescue, just asking to be acknowledged. That's enough. Rest your thoughts. Let them blur. The story will continue, but it does not need your full attention. It never demanded that from the women who lived it either. The lights are low, the halls are still. Another day ends without remark.
All right, we're still here, moving slowly, nothing urgent. This part doesn't resolve anything either, which by now probably feels familiar. Good, that means it's working. By the time many of these women reached the later half of their lives, the idea of an ending stopped being important, not in a dramatic sense, just practically. Life inside a harem did not build toward conclusions. It repeated, softly, indefinitely. There was no final goal to reach, no retirement plan, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. There was only continuation. Women learned to live without narrative arcs, which is strange for us to imagine because we think in stories. Beginnings, middles, endings, success, failure, meaning revealed at the end. But these lives were not structured that way. They were structured around maintenance. Now let's slow down and talk about daily competence, because competence mattered more than passion. A woman who knew how to manage her time, her relationships, her tone of voice, her body language, her reactions, she survived better than someone who felt deeply or dreamed loudly. Competence was safety. This did not mean women lacked inner lives. It meant they learned when not to reveal them. Inner life became private property. Now let's gently revisit food, because food is a strange anchor in controlled environments. Meals were predictable, scheduled, often repetitive, but they were also moments of social interaction, shared silence, small comforts. Women remembered certain dishes fondly, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were consistent. Familiar flavors anchored time. Food marked seasons when little else did. Scarcity was rare inside elite harems, but choice was also rare. This taught women to appreciate availability over preference. a lesson that stayed with them long after. Now let's drift towards sound, because sound shaped experience more than sight. Footsteps in corridors, water flowing in courtyards, fabric brushing stone floors, quiet conversation, occasional laughter quickly suppressed. These sounds created a constant low-level awareness, nothing sudden, nothing chaotic, predictability again. Silence was never total, and total silence would have been unsettling. The environment was designed to soothe without stimulating, a controlled calm. Now imagine how this shaped nervous systems over years, decades. Women became attuned to subtle changes, a different cadence of footsteps, a door closing too firmly, a voice held too long. This hyper-awareness was not anxiety, it was adaptation. Modern language struggles to describe it. It was vigilance without panic, alertness without urgency. Now let's touch on education again, but quietly. Some women learned to read, some already could, some never did, but learning did not automatically lead to expression. Knowledge was internal, useful, protective. Reading religious texts, poetry, instructional manuals, sometimes histories written by men who had never met women like them. They read about power, rarely about people like themselves. This reinforced a sense of invisibility. Now let's talk about children again. Not births, just children. Children inside harems belonged to the institution before they belonged to individuals. Mothers understood this early. Attachment existed, love existed, but expectations were managed carefully. Children might be taken away, educated elsewhere, elevated or discarded. Mothers learned to not imagine futures too vividly. Love was present but guarded, which is one of the hardest emotional balances to maintain. Now let's float towards something subtle and uncomfortable, identity erosion. Over time, women's earlier identities faded, birth names forgotten, languages dulled, customs blurred. New identities formed, not chosen but grown into. Some women stopped remembering who they had been before, not as loss, just as irrelevance. Memory prioritizes usefulness. The present mattered more than the past. Now imagine someone asking an elderly woman inside a harem about her childhood. She might struggle to answer, not because it was traumatic, but because it no longer felt connected to who she was. This disconnection is not often discussed, but it mattered. Now let's slow everything down again. Picture a woman sitting near a window she has looked out of for years. The view has not changed. The seasons have passed. The courtyard looks the same. She does not think, "I have been here too long." She thinks, "This is where I am." Acceptance is not always resignation. Sometimes it is simply efficiency. Now let's talk about friendships one more time, because friendships were the emotional backbone of these lives. Friendships formed quietly, deeply, slowly, based on trust and shared endurance. They were not dramatic. They did not require constant affirmation. They were steady. When a friend disappeared, grief was real but contained. You learned not to let grief disrupt survival. Which sounds cold, but it was necessary. Now let's drift towards something historians struggle with: emotional neutrality. When records describe women as calm, obedient, or passive, they miss the internal work required to maintain that state. Calm was produced, not inherent. It took effort. Now let's touch on boredom again. Yes, again, because it deserves it. Boredom is not empty time, it is unstructured attention. Women filled boredom with thought, reflection, memory, imagination, spiritual practice. Some imagined other lives, some replayed old ones, some stopped imagining entirely. All responses were valid. Now let's gently move toward the idea of usefulness late in life. Older women were valued for knowledge, for memory, for mediation, for instruction. They became quiet authorities, not powerful, but respected, which is not nothing.
Now imagine an elderly woman correcting a younger one gently, not scolding, just adjusting behavior, saving her from a mistake. That moment never appears in history books, but it mattered deeply, because it prevented harm. Now let's step back again. The biggest misunderstanding about these lives is that they were defined by what was done to women. In reality, they were defined by what women did with what was done to them. Not heroically, not rebelliously, just competently. Now we drift toward the close of this part. There is still no ending in sight, which is accurate. Life inside medieval harems did not end with lessons learned or truths revealed. It ended with exhaustion, with age, with quiet disappearance. And that disappearance was not failure, it was completion. A life does not need to be remembered to be fully lived. So if this story feels like it is circling, repeating, refusing to move forward, that is because it mirrors its subject. And that's okay. Let your thoughts slow. Let the words blur. Nothing important is about to happen. Somewhere in the past, another woman finishes another ordinary day. She lies down, she closes her eyes, she expects tomorrow to be much the same. And it probably is. That's enough for now.
All right. This is the last stretch. Nothing sharp, nothing sudden. Just a slow widening. Like the sky right before dawn when you were still half asleep and not ready to wake up yet. Take your time here. This ending is not a finish line. It's more like the sound of footsteps fading down a corridor that never really ends. By the very late medieval period, when the political world around these harems had begun to shift more noticeably, the women inside were already living in a kind of afterlife. Not dead, just out of sync with change. Empires rise loudly. Institutions fade quietly. Harems did not collapse in a single moment. They thinned. They softened. They were restructured, renamed, absorbed into newer systems that pretended to be different while keeping many of the same habits. And the women inside adjusted, as they always had, because adjustment was the only constant. Now let's talk about something we haven't said directly yet: time perception. When your days are highly structured and repetitive, time stops behaving the way we expect it to. Years feel short, days feel long, memory becomes uneven. Women often remembered their early years vividly: the shock of arrival, the learning curve, the fear, the alertness. Middle years blurred, routine took over. Later years felt strangely fast. Suddenly people were gone. Suddenly the body felt heavier. Suddenly younger women filled spaces that once belonged to you. Time didn't march, it drifted. This is one reason why historical timelines feel misleading when applied to these lives. A decade on paper does not equal a decade lived. Now let's slow down and sit with old age, real old age, not the romantic kind. An elderly woman inside a harem was not revered universally. She was tolerated, respected quietly, sometimes ignored. Her body ached, her hearing dulled, her memory skipped. She needed help. Care existed, but it was practical, not sentimental. Other women assisted her because one day they would need the same help. Mutual dependence replaced ambition. This stage of life was not tragic. It was smaller, slower, narrower. And that narrowing brought relief. No more competition, no more attention, no more expectation. Just presence. Now imagine the very last days of one such woman. No dramatic illness, just weakness, just less appetite, just more sleep. No speeches, no confessions, no revelations. When she dies, there is no ceremony beyond what is required. Her belongings are distributed quietly, her sleeping space is reassigned. Within days, it is as if she was never there. This sounds harsh, but it was normal, and normal does not always feel cruel when you live inside it. Now let's talk about the greatest misunderstanding of all, that being forgotten means being erased. Erasure implies intent.
Most of the forgetting that happened here was simply logistical. History has limited storage. It keeps what reinforces narratives. These lives reinforced stability, not change. So they slipped through the cracks. But slipping through cracks is not the same as not existing. Now let's drift outward again, beyond individual lives, toward cultural memory. Long after harems stopped functioning as they once had, the idea of them lingered, distorted, romanticized, condemned, fetishized, rarely understood. Stories focused on power and sex because those were easy hooks. Quiet endurance did not sell well. So the women became symbols instead of people, which is why telling this story slowly matters, because speed turns people into ideas. Now let's gently revisit something we touched earlier: influence without authorship. These women shaped domestic governance, emotional norms, court etiquette, even architectural design, but they never signed their names. Their influence spread horizontally, not vertically, through imitation, through routine, through example. That kind of influence is nearly impossible to trace, which does not make it insignificant. Now think about how many modern systems still rely on the same logic: controlled environments, managed populations, predictability over freedom. People adapt quietly inside them every day. History did not end, it just changed costumes. Now let's pause again. Almost nothing is happening. Picture a late afternoon inside a nearly empty palace wing. Fewer women now, more space, more silence. An older woman walks slowly. She remembers when this place was crowded, loud, busy. She does not miss it, not exactly. Memory does not always produce longing. Sometimes it produces neutrality. She sits, she waits, she exists, and that is enough. Now let's talk about meaning one final time. Modern audiences often want suffering to produce lessons, redemption arcs, moral clarity. But many lives do not exist to teach, they exist to be lived. These women did not endure centuries of controlled existence so that we could extract conclusions. They endured because that was the reality they were placed inside. Meaning was local, immediate, personal. A peaceful day, a trusted friend, a body that still functioned, a routine that worked. That was success. Now let's slow everything to the quietest possible pace. Imagine the cumulative weight of millions of days lived this way across centuries, not dramatic days, just ordinary ones. That weight shaped history more than wars did, because systems are held together by ordinary compliance far more than by force. And women inside medieval harems were experts in maintaining systems, not because they believed in them, but because they understood how survival worked. Now let's address something gently but clearly. Recognizing this does not justify the system. Understanding endurance does not excuse constraint. It simply respects reality. We can hold empathy without rewriting lives into something they were not. Now we approach the true ending, not of the topic, just of this telling. There is no final woman, no final door, no final decree. The last harem does not close with a sound, it just becomes something else. And the last woman inside does not know she is last. She thinks it is just another day. She adjusts her pace, she follows routine, she rests when tired. She has no idea she will be discussed centuries later by people lying in dark rooms, listening to her world drift past them like a distant tide. And honestly, she wouldn't care. Her life did not need an audience. So if you're still awake, that's okay. If you're drifting, that's perfect. This story was never meant to keep you alert. It was meant to accompany you, quietly, respectfully, without demanding anything, just like the lives it describes. The lights are low now. The corridors are nearly empty. The sound of water echoes softly somewhere far away. Another ordinary day ends. Another ordinary life fades, and history moves forward, carrying very little with it, but enough for us to sit here, quietly, and remember that most of the past was not loud. It was patient. Rest.
All right. You're still here. The palace is still standing. The lamps are still low. Tonight, we drift toward the women who did something unusual without ever intending to be remarkable. The ones whose names survived, not because history was kind, but because circumstance accidentally preserved them. And right away, let's be clear. For every named woman we remember, there were thousands we never will. Survival in the records was not merit-based, it was proximity-based, timing-based, occasionally luck-based, mostly arbitrary. But the women whose names endured give us something rare, texture. These women were not always powerful. Many started exactly like everyone else, young, displaced, observed, evaluated, assigned a place. What separated them later was not ambition alone, it was longevity, timing, and the ability to remain useful to the right people for a very long time. Let's begin with mothers, because motherhood was the most reliable way to enter history. A woman who bore a future ruler instantly gained narrative importance. Chroniclers cared about lineage, succession, bloodlines. Suddenly, her name mattered, or at least a version of it did, often modified, sometimes replaced entirely. These women did not automatically become powerful. They became relevant, which is different. A mother of a prince lived with constant pressure. Every illness mattered, every rumor mattered. She learned restraint quickly. Overprotectiveness could be interpreted as ambition. Detachment could be read as weakness. Balance was everything. Some mothers mastered this. They positioned themselves as calm, pious, non-threatening, deeply loyal to the system. This made them acceptable, safe. Others leaned into influence, carefully. They built networks among tutors, administrators, and senior women. They shaped education. They nudged decisions. They protected their children quietly. When their sons rose, these women rose with them. Titles followed, respect followed, sometimes real authority followed. But it was fragile. If a son died young, the mother fell instantly. Her status evaporated. Her name slipped back toward obscurity. Now let's float to another category, the senior companions. These women were not mothers of rulers. They were trusted presences, advisors, confidants, emotional anchors, often older, often highly educated, often deeply familiar with court politics. They listened more than they spoke, which made rulers trust them. Some advised on personal matters, others on ceremonial ones. Some mediated conflicts, some softened bad news. Their influence was subtle, almost invisible, which made it last. A few of these women appear in records as patrons, builders of mosques, sponsors of schools, donors to religious institutions. This was one of the safest ways to leave a mark. Piety was respected. Charity was praised. It framed influence as virtue. Behind the scenes, these acts also secured loyalty. Clerics remembered donors. Communities protected benefactors. Reputation extended beyond palace walls. These women understood legacy better than most men. Now let's talk about a different survival path, talent. Some women were exceptional musicians, poets, calligraphers, storytellers. Their skills were rare enough to be documented, their performances noted, their verses copied. In Al-Andalus and Abbasid courts especially, cultured women could become minor celebrities within elite circles. Their names appeared in literary anthologies, marginal notes, biographical dictionaries. This was not fame in the modern sense, it was preservation. Still, talent alone was not enough. These women had to navigate attention carefully. Admiration could turn into resentment. Visibility could invite control.
Many deliberately limited their exposure, performed selectively, spoke cautiously, maintained reputations for modesty. Talent was safest when framed as service. Now let's gently address something else: myth-making. Some women's stories were reshaped after their deaths, sanitized, romanticized, simplified. A politically astute woman became devoted. A pragmatic survivor became virtuous. A strategic advisor became selfless. This made their stories palatable. Real complexity was uncomfortable, so chroniclers smoothed edges, which means that even remembered women are partially fictionalized. But fragments remain, small contradictions, hints of agency, evidence of calculation. Those hints matter. Now let's drift toward women who ruled indirectly. Regents, queen mothers, guardians of child rulers. These women often wielded real power, issuing orders, appointing officials, managing resources, all while officially acting on behalf of someone else. Their authority was temporary by design, which made them vulnerable. Once the child ruler came of age, they were expected to step back gracefully. Not all did. Some succeeded, others were pushed aside. Some were accused of overreach, or manipulation, or ambition, which were coded criticisms, gendered criticisms. Their legacies were contested, praised by some, condemned by others. This tension is often visible in records, which is itself evidence of influence. People do not argue about irrelevant figures. Now let's talk about the cost of being remembered. Women whose names survived rarely lived peaceful lives. Attention brought scrutiny, influence brought enemies, documentation brought judgment. Their private lives were dissected, their motives questioned, their emotions interpreted through moral frameworks they did not choose. Being remembered meant losing privacy permanently. Many unnamed women likely lived quieter, steadier lives, less pressure, less danger, less narrative distortion. So survival in history is not inherently a reward. Now let's float towards something subtle: silence as legacy. Some women deliberately avoided leaving traces. They did not sponsor buildings. They did not cultivate chroniclers. They did not attach themselves to institutions. They focused on immediate survival, on relationships, on day-to-day stability. Their legacy existed only in memory, in children they raised, in routines they maintained, in advice passed quietly from one woman to another. This legacy died with witnesses, but it mattered just as much. Now let's pause on something that rarely gets acknowledged: emotional labor. Women whose names survived often acted as emotional stabilizers for rulers, for courts, for households. They absorbed anxiety, smoothed tensions, maintained appearances. This labor was invisible but essential. It kept systems functioning. History rarely records emotional work, but without it, chaos follows. Now let's slow down again. Imagine a woman near the end of her life. She has lived through multiple rulers, multiple upheavals. She has seen women arrive terrified and leave transformed. She has watched children grow into adults who barely recognize her. She is remembered, or she is not. At this point, it hardly matters. What matters is that she endured. She adapted to systems she did not design. She navigated power without formal authority. She learned restraint when expression was dangerous. She found meaning in limited spaces. Her life was not extraordinary, and that is exactly why it matters. The women whose names survived give us entry points, but they are not the story. They are windows. In the next part, we will drift toward endings, not dramatic endings, just what happened when life inside the harem finally stopped, how women faced old age, illness, release, and death. For now, let the palace grow quieter, footsteps slow, conversations taper off. Somewhere, a woman whose name might appear in a footnote one day closes her eyes, and the system continues around her, indifferent, steady, and very, very old.